In 1945, the last months of the war, a German U-boat known as U-745 sent out its final transmission somewhere in the Baltic Sea. The message was brief: coordinates, a code name, and then silence. It was assumed lost like hundreds of other submarines that vanished during the chaos of Nazi Germany's collapse. But half a century later, something impossible happened. In 1999, divers off the coast of Finland discovered a wreck so perfectly preserved it looked as if it had been frozen in time. The sub's lights were still intact, the hull barely corroded, and inside, when they peered through the glass, they saw something that made even hardened veterans go silent. You see, U-745 wasn't supposed to exist there. Every wartime record said it had gone down hundreds of kilometers away. No SOS, no survivors, no sign of a fight. Just gone. Yet now it sat, upright, as though resting peacefully on the ocean floor, almost waiting to be found. And the real mystery wasn't just how it ended up there, it was what the divers found inside. The air inside the submarine was still trapped, sealed for decades. And through the viewing ports, they could make out the eerie outline of the crew, motionless, preserved in the frozen silence of the Baltic depths. The control levers were set as if someone had tried to surface moments before death. One of the gauges showed a pressure reading that made no sense. It was far too low for the depth it rested at. But that wasn't the only strange thing. The navigation equipment, still faintly visible through layers of silt, showed a course that pointed nowhere, a dead straight line leading into empty sea. No destination, no coded orders, just the abyss. The Discovery team initially thought it was a misidentified wreck. After all, hundreds of U-boats were lost near Finland, especially during Germany's desperate retreat from the Eastern Front. But the serial numbers on the propeller matched U-745 exactly, which meant the impossible was true. Somehow, this submarine had traveled far beyond its last known position, in waters it was never supposed to enter. Historians began pulling records from the German archives, and that's when things got even stranger. The final message from U-745 wasn't a distress signal. It wasn't a navigation log either. It was one word: Schatten, German for shadow. It made no sense on its own. But in certain naval codes used late in the war, shadow referred to an operation, one that, officially, never existed. There were whispers of secret Nazi escape missions in 1945, especially in the Baltic region where U-boats were known to carry high-ranking officers or experimental cargo. But every historian who tried to trace Operation Shadow found the same thing: missing pages, redacted logs, destroyed radio transcripts. The kind of systematic silence that doesn't happen by accident. So what was U-745 carrying that was worth burying for 50 years? Some say it was personnel. Others claim it was technology, an experimental power source, maybe, or stolen Soviet intelligence. But one theory, buried deep in Cold War naval documents, suggests something far stranger. According to Finnish fishermen who reported seeing ghost lights under the water around 1945, the submarine didn't sink from battle. It simply disappeared. They described glowing shapes beneath the ice, then nothing. No explosion, no wreckage, just sudden absence. Half a century later, when divers rediscovered the wreck, those same coordinates aligned eerily close to the fishermen's stories. Same location, same pattern of disappearance. Even stranger, the submarine's onboard clock, still faintly legible under layers of corrosion, had stopped exactly at 2:17, but the day and month dial were jammed somewhere between January and March, suggesting a malfunction midwinter, meaning it likely sank under ice. But the bodies, still preserved, showed no signs of drowning. Forensic teams concluded that the crew didn't die from pressure collapse or flooding. They suffocated. But the oxygen levels recorded inside the sealed compartments didn't match what should have happened in that time frame. It's as if something drained the air slowly, methodically, like a candle being snuffed one by one. And yet, not a single valve was broken. The hatch was sealed from the inside. That fact alone sent waves through the research team, because if the submarine was sealed from within, that means they didn't try to escape. They chose to stay. When German naval experts were shown the photos, they noticed something even the divers missed. The periscope was extended. That might sound small, but for submarines, it's everything. You only raise the periscope if you're at periscope depth, right beneath the surface. Which means, for some reason, U-745 surfaced, and then sank straight down, vertically, without a struggle. One diver described it later. It looked like they'd parked it there, as if they found their grave and went to sleep. But the deeper you go into the story, the less it makes sense. Because during that same week in 1945, Soviet Naval Command reported intercepting a U-boat signal off the coast of Estonia, over 400 kilometers from U-745's last coordinates. The frequency matched perfectly, but the Soviets couldn't trace it. When they triangulated the signal, it appeared to be coming from under the ice, far too deep for any radio to transmit. They dismissed it as a ghost frequency, the kind that happens when cold water distorts long-wave signals. But here's the thing. That ghost signal lasted almost 6 minutes, far longer than random distortion could last. And in those 6 minutes, Soviet operators recorded something chilling. A human voice repeating the same phrase, over and over. Wir kehren nicht zurück. We do not return. No one ever linked that message to U-745 back then. But after the wreck's discovery, analysts noticed that the transmission time matched the submarine's clock to the minute. At this point, researchers started calling the wreck the ghost U-boat. Local divers swore their compasses glitched near it, that their depth gauges spun erratically, that the water around it felt colder than everywhere else. Some laughed it off as superstition, others refused to dive again. But a few returned, and what they brought back blurred the line between mystery and madness. Inside one of the compartments, they found a notebook sealed inside a watertight case. The pages were still legible. It belonged to Oberleutnant Helmut Farber, the captain. His last entry, dated February 11, 1945, read, "We are surrounded by silence. The sea no longer obeys. No coordinates, no orders, just that line." You'd think this would settle it, that the sub was lost under ice, forgotten by history. But 2 years after its rediscovery, something new surfaced that threw everything back into chaos. A retired Soviet cryptographer revealed that in 1946, 1 year after the war, a classified listening station in Murmansk picked up a signal on the same frequency as U-745's. For 12 seconds, it broadcast the same word it had sent in 1945, Schatten, then silence. The signal couldn't have come from the wreck. It was still sealed, untouched, at the bottom of the Baltic. And yet, the coordinates from 1946 placed the transmission in the exact same spot. Think about that. A submarine that vanished in 1945, found perfectly preserved in 1999, sent out a transmission in 1946 from beneath the sea. Even the skeptics couldn't explain it. Engineers said old radio echoes could bounce off the ionosphere, replaying decades later. But that doesn't hold for undersea transmissions. Others said maybe a Soviet sub reused the same call sign, intentionally or by mistake. But the call sign was long retired and buried with Nazi records. So the only logical explanation was none at all. Every new discovery only deepened the mystery. The pressure inside the hull was abnormally stable, like it had been preserved in a pocket of denser water. The batteries, somehow, hadn't corroded. Even the paint still clung to the hull's edges. It wasn't just well preserved, it was unnaturally untouched, like time itself had avoided it. One scientist said it best, "It's as if the Baltic took it, then gave it back 50 years later, exactly as it was." And maybe that's not as poetic as it sounds. Because some historians quietly believe U-745 was part of an experimental mission, one that tested something far beyond conventional warfare. Nazi Germany, desperate in its final months, was obsessed with creating miracle weapons, V-2 rockets, jet fighters, experimental magnetic propulsion systems. What if this submarine was a prototype for something that went wrong? Documents recovered from a destroyed naval yard in Kiel mention a classified U-boat variant codenamed Project Nebel, Project Fog. designed to use electromagnetic fields to mask its radar signature. Sounds impossible, but the Third Reich poured millions into similar projects, some real, some delusional. If U-745 was testing this device, a misfire could have fried its instruments, killed its crew, and sealed it beneath the ice in a bubble of its own making. That would explain the radio interference, the warped compasses, even the pressure anomaly. But then you'd have to ask, how did it survive perfectly intact for 50 years when everything around it decayed? There's one more clue that nobody talks about. When they raised the captain's logbook to the surface, one of the divers noticed something else tucked beneath it. A photograph, water-stained but unmistakable. It showed the crew standing on deck before departure, smiling, the Baltic behind them. But in the reflection of the periscope glass, you can see something else. A dark shape, long and sharp, hovering behind them, just above the horizon. And according to the expedition's official records, that photograph, like the radio tapes, has never been seen again. The only thing left is the wreck itself, still lying there, half buried in silt, silent, sealed, and still watching the surface as if waiting for another signal. Because the truth is, U-745 didn't just vanish once, it vanished twice, once into the sea and once into history. And every time someone gets close to uncovering what really happened, something pulls the story back into the deep. When the U-745 story hit the news in 1999, it barely made headlines outside Northern Europe. But within military history circles, it set off a quiet panic, not because of superstition, but because the wreck contradicted basic physics. The Baltic Sea is cold, yes, but not cold enough to preserve organic matter so perfectly for half a century. Even sunken ships from the 1960s nearby showed more corrosion. Yet this one looked almost paused, like it hadn't been lying there for decades but placed there yesterday. The first expedition team returned a year later with advanced scanning tools. Sonar mapping revealed something even stranger. The seabed beneath the submarine wasn't natural. The sub rested inside a shallow depression, perfectly oval, almost like a cradle. Around it, the silt was magnetized, as if exposed to an intense electromagnetic pulse. And the center point of that magnetic distortion aligned exactly with the sub's power generator. Now, here's where things get technical. U-boats used diesel-electric systems. Nothing fancy, just mechanical and chemical. But when they X-rayed the generator casing, they found traces of a metallic compound that didn't match any wartime alloys. Some claimed it was a modern contaminant, maybe from the recovery equipment. Others weren't so sure. The compound was made of an alloy containing bismuth and magnesium, materials used decades later in stealth and propulsion experiments. In other words, this 1945 submarine had something inside it that shouldn't have existed until the late 1960s. So either history was wrong, or someone had been inside it after it sank. The official Finnish maritime agency closed the wreck to civilian divers soon after. They said it was for safety. But rumors spread that military divers had gone down quietly, retrieving small, unmarked crates from the lower compartments. No photos, no reports. Just sealed containers, loaded at night onto trucks bound for a naval base that doesn't appear on any public map. And from that point onward, the wreck of U-745 became off-limits. No media, no permits. Even the coordinates were removed from official databases. When independent divers tried to go back, they found sonar jammers in the area, devices designed to scramble depth readings. That's when the conspiracy theories really took off. Some said the sub carried stolen Nazi gold. Others said it was transporting scientists from secret research programs. But one claim stood out, the quote, Kronos theory. It came from a declassified British intelligence memo dated August 1945, recovered by historians decades later. The memo referenced unverified enemy experiments in temporal displacement within naval sectors of the Baltic. It sounded absurd at first. But when you consider the electromagnetic anomalies and unexplainable preservation, the word temporal doesn't feel so crazy anymore. One scientist who reviewed the data said something that still gives me chills. If you were to design an accidental time capsule, this is exactly what it would look like. Of course, time travel makes for great fiction, but physics doesn't support that kind of distortion. Still, one unexplained anomaly kept the door open. The silt samples collected from the seabed beneath U-745 contained layers inconsistent with normal sedimentation. The top layers, those supposedly formed after 1945, were missing. It's like the sub skipped the natural process of time, appearing on the ocean floor decades later, with no trace of having fallen through the intervening years. Which brings us back to that word, Schatten, shadow. Historians now believe Operation Shadow wasn't just a code name, it was literal. A mission involving a vessel meant to disappear from detection entirely. Nazi naval scientists in 1944 were testing magnetic camouflage, a theoretical technique to distort magnetic fields around submarines, effectively making them invisible to radar. But one project diary mentions something deeper, the Selbstversuch, the self-test, meaning one crew volunteered to activate the system under real conditions. And guess which U-boat was stationed at the test site that month? U-745. Now imagine this. You're a submarine captain in February 1945. The Reich is falling apart. Berlin is burning. You receive an order. One last experiment. A promise that if you can vanish from Allied radar, you can change the course of the war. You activate the machine, and it works. You vanish. But not from radar, from time itself. Far-fetched? Maybe. But there's one more piece that refuses to fit neatly into any rational explanation. In 2012, a sonar team scanning for shipwrecks near the Gulf of Finland picked up a second anomaly about 18 nautical miles from the original site. It was small, metallic, and nearly identical in shape to the device attached to U-745's generator casing, except this one was detached, buried halfway in the silt. When retrieved, it was found to be warm to the touch despite being under freezing water. And etched into the metal, faint but visible, was a serial code. Nebel 745, Project Fog. So whatever that device was, it had survived and somehow retained energy for decades. The team that found it tried to send it to a research facility in Sweden. But the crate never arrived. Somewhere between departure and customs, the entire shipment vanished. No paper trail, no record, just gone. Some believe the device is now locked in a classified NATO archive. Others whisper it was destroyed, buried where no one could ever activate it again. Because if it really could distort electromagnetic fields, it could also do something far more dangerous: bend navigation, communication, even perception. Imagine if the machine didn't just hide the submarine from radar, but from the very flow of time. That might explain the intact bodies, the preserved metal, the uncorroded paint. The sub never decayed because, in a sense, it never aged. It was trapped in a pocket of suspended time, like a photograph, until something broke the field and released it 50 years later. You might wonder, what could have caused that? A geological shift? A magnetic storm? Maybe even another experiment nearby that interfered with it. But one diver's account stands out. During a follow-up descent, he claimed to see a faint glow inside the conning tower, like a pulse, deep blue and rhythmic, fading when they approached. The team thought it was reflected light from their equipment, but when they surfaced, their instruments showed a small electromagnetic spike at the exact moment he saw the glow. And that spike? It matched the same frequency as the 1946 transmission. Think about that. The same pulse that sent the word shadow across the sea 1 year after the war ended might still echo, faintly, from the wreck itself, as if the machine inside is still alive, still running, still waiting. But maybe the creepiest part isn't the technology, it's the human story beneath it. Because after the recovery team opened the submarine's interior logs, they noticed something about the handwriting. It changed, suddenly, near the end. From neat, precise script to something frantic, uneven, almost childlike, as if the captain himself was writing under immense pressure, or something else entirely. The final lines read, "The sea is not where we are. It's above us now." That phrase baffled everyone. What could it mean? A hallucination from oxygen loss, or a literal description of what they experienced? Some theorists interpret it symbolically, as if the crew believed they'd passed into another layer of existence, watching the ocean from the outside. Others say it was a metaphor for death, the realization they were already gone. But when you connect that to the radio message, "We do not return," it starts to sound less poetic and more deliberate. Maybe they knew exactly what was happening. Maybe U-745 wasn't lost at all. Maybe it succeeded. And if it did, then that submarine wasn't destroyed by the sea. It escaped it. Yet the question that remains is, escaped to where? Because if time stood still for that U-boat, then it's not really resting at the bottom of the Baltic. It's still out there, somewhere between the seconds, repeating its signal like a heartbeat that refuses to die. And every few decades, when the conditions are just right, when the Earth's magnetic field aligns, when storms churn the Baltic ice, you can still hear it faintly on old frequencies. One word, carried through static and salt water: Schatten, shadow. By the early 2000s, the ghost U-boat had turned from a classified curiosity into something closer to legend. Every few years, a new witness or diver would come forward with their version of what they saw near the wreck: strange lights, radio interference, eerie humming through the water. Most were brushed off as hoaxes, but one encounter in 2004 still stands apart. A Finnish research vessel named the Polarstern II was conducting a magnetic survey of the Gulf of Bothnia, not even looking for U-745. But one night around 2 a.m., their sonar operator noticed something impossible. A metallic object appeared on radar, moving slowly, almost gliding, roughly 300 meters below the surface. The operator assumed it was another ship until he checked the transponder readouts. There were none. The object had no signature, no propulsion noise, and yet it moved in a straight, deliberate line toward the coordinates of U-745. Then, just as it reached the spot, it vanished. The radar blinked clean. The crew laughed it off until the next morning, when every compass aboard began spinning erratically, and the ship's instruments logged a short, sharp electromagnetic surge, the same frequency recorded from the wreck years earlier. For nearly 20 seconds, their radio filled with static, followed by a faint voice repeating the same German phrase: "Der Schatten bewegt sich." The shadow moves. No one outside the ship's crew ever heard the tape, but a declassified report later confirmed the event. The military labeled it electrical interference. Yet several crew members resigned afterward and never spoke publicly again. So if that signal really came from the same source, then maybe U-745 wasn't entirely still. Maybe whatever it had been testing wasn't fully dormant. In the years since, deep-sea acoustic specialists have occasionally picked up unexplained low-frequency pulses near the wreck site. Always around the same depth. Always during winter storms, when the Baltic's salinity and temperature layers shift. The signals are too structured to be geological, repeating in a rhythmic 3-beat pattern. It's as if something down there is trying, very faintly, to power back up. But here's the part that truly unsettles the few who still study it. Each pulse coincides with micro-anomalies detected on nearby communication channels, bursts of static that sound almost like reversed speech. When reversed and filtered, the words form fragments of German naval terminology: Tauschen, Befehl, tiefer, dive, order, deeper. Now think about that for a second. A submarine sealed for 50 years, its crew long dead, its systems supposedly inert, yet something in that hull keeps whispering commands into the dark. Some modern physicists have tried to rationalize it. They suggest piezoelectric effects, pressure turning into electricity inside the old circuits, triggering random signals. But that still doesn't explain the precision, the language, the timing. It's almost as if whatever happened inside that sub left an imprint, a loop, endlessly replaying itself in the deep. And maybe that's why no one wants to touch it anymore. Because every diver who's gone close in the last 2 decades describes the same feeling. Not fear, exactly, but displacement. As though time itself thickens the deeper you go. Watches slow down. Oxygen gauges miscount. The sound of your own breathing feels delayed. One diver even said he could hear faint knocking through his headset, not from his team, but from inside the hull. 3 knocks, then silence. 3 again. Then one final, distant clang, like a hand brushing the inside of a metal wall. He surfaced shaking, refused to dive again, and later described it in one sentence. It didn't sound like the past. It sounded like now. That statement stuck with investigators because when they checked the sonar timestamps, they realized something uncanny. The exact moment he heard the knocks was precisely 2:17 a.m. The same minute, the submarine's clock had stopped in 1945. From that point on, the Finnish authorities sealed off the area permanently. The official reason: unstable currents and risk of collapse. But if you look at classified maritime maps leaked a few years later, you'll find something odd. A circular exclusion zone nearly 10 kilometers wide, and in the center, a small marker labeled only with one word: shadow. Still, curiosity doesn't stay buried. In 2016, a private expedition funded by a group of European historians attempted to map the zone with autonomous drones. Most of them malfunctioned, but one drone made it back, with exactly 5 minutes of footage. It shows the seabed, eerily still. The wreck sits perfectly upright, silt curling around its hull like smoke. Then, just before the feed cuts off, the lights on the drone flicker, and a faint shimmer appears over the submarine. A distortion in the water, almost invisible, like heat rising from asphalt. The pressure sensors spike, then drop to 0. The screen goes black. When the engineers reviewed the data, the pressure drop shouldn't have been possible. It implied the drone had entered an air pocket under hundreds of feet of water. But the Baltic has no such cavities, unless, of course, something created one. So what is U-745 now? A tomb? A relic? Or a wound in the fabric of the sea that never really closed? It's tempting to dismiss all of this as legend. But even legends start somewhere, and this one has too much evidence to ignore. A preserved hull, a sealed crew, a repeating signal that defies explanation. Maybe the simplest truth is that the machine aboard that sub, whatever Project Fog really was, succeeded in bending the rules of reality just enough to trap itself between them. And maybe that's why it reappeared 50 years later, because whatever anomaly held it finally collapsed. But if that's true, it means it could happen again. The machine could reactivate, the field could reopen, and something else, maybe another wreck, maybe something newer, could vanish the same way, which might explain one final, chilling coincidence. In 2019, a Swedish naval patrol reported a small sonar contact off the same coastline, a modern civilian submersible used for deep-sea research. It vanished mid-transmission. The last words from the operator before radio silence: "We've found the shadow." The signal cut at 2:17, and no trace of the submersible has ever been found. Somewhere beneath the ice-cold waters of the Baltic, a German submarine still waits, silent, sealed, perfectly preserved. Its crew may be gone, but its pulse isn't. Every few decades, it surfaces in the only way it knows how, through a whisper in static, a flash of sonar, a shimmer in the deep. And if you ever find yourself sailing those waters, far from shore, late at night, and your radio suddenly crackles with a word that sounds half familiar, half forgotten, stop. Because you might just be hearing the same signal that's been echoing for 80 years. Schotten. It's strange how the ocean keeps secrets better than people ever could. When you stand on the shore and stare out into that endless gray horizon, it feels calm, predictable, almost empty. But somewhere below, buried under layers of pressure and silence, the story of U-745 still stirs, and maybe, in a way, it's still unfolding. After the 2019 disappearance of that Swedish submersible, NATO quietly expanded surveillance in the Baltic. They didn't announce it publicly, but leaked maritime radar data shows something unusual: a pattern of magnetic disturbances forming and disappearing in the same grid coordinates every few months. Each disturbance lasts roughly 8 minutes. Always at night. Always at precisely 2:17. It's as if the sea keeps replaying the same moment in time, over and over again. Some think it's a coincidence. Others say it's the lingering residue of whatever energy that experimental device unleashed all those decades ago. But there's a darker theory whispered by a few researchers who've risked their careers even mentioning it, that U-745 isn't stuck in time at all. It's moving through it. Imagine this, a vessel trapped in a loop, reliving its final moments in fragments, flickering in and out of our reality like a skipping record. Each time the magnetic fields align, it becomes visible again, not as a ghost, but as a repetition of the same event, frozen in replay. The captain reaching for the controls, the pressure dropping, the radio flaring to life with that single word, Schotten, shadow, then silence again. If that sounds impossible, remember, the ocean is full of phenomena we can't yet explain. Rogue waves that appear from nowhere, magnetic anomalies that bend instruments, sounds, like the bloop, that echo for miles with no source. What if U-745 is simply one of those anomalies, man-made, but still bound to the laws of nature, even if we don't understand them yet? A few years ago, a deep-sea acoustics engineer named Elias Korhonen released a report that nearly no one noticed. He'd been analyzing low-frequency ocean sounds captured by NATO sensors in 2021 when he found something hidden in the data, a pattern repeating every 45 days. A deep, mechanical rhythm. When amplified, it sounded unmistakably like a submarine engine, but one running on pre-1945 diesel frequencies. Korhonen cross-referenced the sound with all known shipwrecks and found no match. The location? The Baltic Trench, less than 30 kilometers from U-745's last known position. He published the findings, but within a month, the file vanished from the research archive. His university called it corrupted. His access credentials were revoked. 2 weeks later, he left his position without explanation. A friend later claimed he'd received an anonymous message containing just 3 words: "Stop tracing shadows." What unsettled him most wasn't the sound itself, though. It was what came after. Because near the end of the recording, there's a faint human voice, distorted but clear enough to transcribe. It says, "Der Himmel ist leer." The sky is empty. That exact phrase appears in the captain's logbook recovered from U-745. It's almost poetic, if it weren't so horrifying. A message written in 1945, somehow repeated through sonar data 76 years later. And maybe that's the real message of this whole story, that history doesn't just stay buried. It hums beneath us, waiting for someone to listen. For now, the official stance is simple. U-745 is a preserved World War II wreck, nothing more. The reports of signals, lights, and disappearances are dismissed as myths. But there's a reason they've never declassified the full dive footage from 1999. Divers who worked that expedition still refuse interviews. The few who have spoken off record describe one last chilling detail. When they first shone their floodlights into the control room, the captain's chair wasn't empty. There was a skeleton sitting upright, head tilted slightly, as though still watching the instruments. But a month later, when the Finnish Navy returned to film the wreck for documentation, that skeleton was gone. No disturbance in the silt, no sign of removal, just gone. One diver swore he saw faint boot prints leading down the corridor, stopping near the sealed hatch, the same hatch locked from the inside. People like to believe the past is dead, that it can't reach us anymore. But maybe it's more like the sea. You can't see the current from the surface, but it's always there, pulling quietly beneath your feet. And maybe somewhere, right now, under those same waters, U-745 still glides in that invisible current, repeating its last mission, bound to an order that never ended. Every so often, coastal radar still catches a flicker, a metallic echo that appears for a few seconds, then fades. When plotted, those flickers trace a slow, deliberate path. Not random, not drifting, a course heading north, toward the Arctic. No one knows what waits up there, buried beneath miles of ice. But if you ever ask the old fishermen who sail those waters, they'll tell you the same story. That sometimes on windless nights, you can hear an engine deep below, humming softly beneath the waves. No wake, no ship lights. Just the low rumble of something moving where nothing should. And if you listen closely, very closely, between the static and the sea spray, you might catch the faintest whisper, a single word that doesn't belong in any ocean, shatten. And when you hear it, don't try to answer, because maybe it isn't calling you, maybe it's calling you back.